If you go back and look at all of his speeches and Ted Cruz's speeches and many of the Republican candidates before Trump was selected as the Republican nominee, but even after, he kept doing it. But they were competing with who was the most anti-Muslim and who was going to be the toughest on national security. And they didn't hide that what they meant was who was going to keep out as many Muslims, prosecute as many Muslims. And we were the scapegoats. And that created a huge uptick in discrimination. So again, we're talking 2015, 2016, and he had made these promises to them. And so I have an article called A Muslim Registry, the precursor to internment, ? And in that article, and that's on my ssrn.com page, I go through all of his statements and how all the promises he made to his base, Trump, in saying, I'm going to put a special registration database together. I'm going to keep them out. I'm going to deport them. I'm going to deny them citizenship. So it wasn't a coincidence that executive order, the Muslim ban, came out 7 days, or it was 10 days, I think, right after he was inaugurated, because Stephen Bannon was still his advisor, and Stephen Bannon is the head of Breitbart, very far right, and he effectively penned it and said, here you go, sign it. We got to keep our promise. But so that was really domestic politics, trying to feed the racists and give them the red meat they wanted and rile them up into their racist frenzy. But at the same time, he needs to have good relations with Saudi Arabia because America sells billions of dollars in military equipment to the Saudis, and that money is what feeds our defense industry, right? So if he put them on the list, then he could have lost that business. Similarly with Egypt, Egypt is a neighbor of Israel. Israel is a strong ally of the United States. There's a peace agreement. And they do not want to have a bad relationship with Egypt because they want relations between Egypt and Israel to stay strong. And also Egypt helps America in its war on terror. And it helped it in doing its dirty business during the war on terror, where they had extradition, where the American CIA would go kidnap people and then send them to black sites, including in Egypt and in Saudi Arabia, where they would then outsource torturing so that CIA agents couldn't be prosecuted for torture, because there are laws on the books.
Wait, can you go a little further in that one? What's that about? I've never heard of this.
So there's something called extraordinary rendition and black sites. If you Google that, you'll find it. And so right after 9/11, when they were still looking for who committed 9/11, what are the terrorists, they were trying to find Osama bin Laden and all of the organizers, and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the CIA was engaging in pretty blatant human rights violations by kidnapping people that they were convinced were members of Al-Qaeda and convinced had something to do with 9/11. But
kidnapping U.S. citizens or?
No, abroad, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, sometimes in Europe. And they wanted to get information out of them, and they wanted to torture them to get that information out of them. But there are laws in the US that you can actually sue and prosecute CIA agents if they commit torture. So they would outsource it to Egyptian, Jordanian, Saudi Arabian intelligence services, who had no problem torturing, because that's what they do on a regular basis to their own people. And so they needed the cooperation of these regimes. So that's kind of the long and short of it, is that racism will flourish until it hits up against another interest. And these geopolitical interests, where you have billions of dollars at stake, are going to supersede feeding red meat to the base. And so he didn't really need to include every Muslim country. Most of them weren't even sophisticated enough to know that, for example, the people who committed 9/11 happened to be Saudi citizens, which doesn't make Saudi Arabia or the Saudi citizenship guilty of terrorism, because again, you can have 10 Americans commit a terrorist act, doesn't mean all Americans are terrorists. But still, even though you would think that, well, maybe he would be seeking to punish Saudi Arabia, for example, for not being aggressive enough in routing out terrorism within its own borders. No, it was political posturing and political theater at the expense of American Muslim civil rights.
Yeah, that's an unfair thing. These same people would argue that democracy can't coincide with Islam. That if you have a majority Muslim narrative occurring in the United States, for example, then that narrative will start being anti-democracy. While, just like you said earlier, a lot of Muslims, especially in the Middle East, are very pro-democracy and not pro-caliphate, not pro this, being under one ruler theocracy kind of situation. So what would you say to them? Is Islam and democracy mutually exclusive as a Muslim law professor
I
living in a
think
democratic country?
you have to ask yourself first, what do you mean by democracy? There's populist democracy, there's representative democracy, there's different types of democracy. But let's say, generally speaking, democracy is self-governance, right? Some form of self-governance where the people can determine and can have some say in different ways, different degrees, as to how they're governed. And there, there is no rule, or there's no religious rule in Islam that bars that. However, in every single religion, there is a privileging of religious authorities. And if you are going to have a theocracy, whether it's an Islamic theocracy, a Hindu theocracy, a Jewish theocracy, or a Christian theocracy, you are by definition giving most of the political power to religious leaders, whether it's the imams, the sheikhs, the bishops, the pastors, the preachers, the priests, the rabbi, because they're the religious experts who will then tell you, here is how society should be structured. And then from there, you have to ask yourself, okay, can anybody be in those positions? What are the exclusions to those positions? And what if we want people who aren't necessarily religious leaders who also, and they're selected by the people? I mean, it's another issue is, do the people select the religious leaders the same way they select elected officials? And so therefore it's a democracy, but instead of electing a civilian who runs for elected office, you vote for the rabbi, you vote for which imam you want, right, to lead you. But as long as, but that's the definition of democracy. That's like the fundamental core is self-governance and having a say in how your society is structured. And the more hierarchical it is, the more exclusivist it is, the harder it is to do that. But what we have to understand is we have a lot of anti-democratic practices in the United States. For example, our laws nearly guarantee that only wealthy people can become elected officials. That's not very democratic. There's nothing in the law that says you can't be elected if you're poor, but the campaign finance laws make it impossible, practically impossible for poor people to be elected because they don't have the money to campaign. And yet rich people can spend as much as they want. So when they had Citizens United, the Supreme Court case that said corporations are people too, and they can donate and you can create PACs, and then those PACs support the candidates indirectly, but they do it through media campaigns, well, then you're guaranteeing wealthy people. Nobody's going around saying, well, that's not very democratic. Well, some people are, the progressives, but you take that for granted. Similarly, why don't we have an equal representation of women?
What do you mean by that?
Representation of minorities. All of these are due to social trends that produce anti-democratic outcomes. And so I don't think the right question is whether Islam is compatible with democracy. It's because that democracy is more of a sociological question, and religion is just one of the components that fits into a particular society's ecosystem. And you have many Muslim majority countries that are anti-democratic, that are dictatorships, that are monarchies, and they're not theocracies. And religion is not what is setting the laws and the rules, and they're not democratic. And yet you also have Turkey as an example, where Erdogan, he is the Islamist country, right? He's the Islamist party. But the way that there's other structures in place that make sure that just because he happens to be a political Islamist in his party, that doesn't mean that then he can just completely eliminate all the opposition, right? So it's all about the systems. Can you debate things? Do you have an open press? Do you have an independent judiciary? Do you have education that teaches people critical thinking rather than feeding them propaganda and misinformation? So there's just so many factors that produce a democratic environment. And it's a cop-out and it's intellectually lazy to say, oh, it's just a religion. It's way more complicated than that.
Okay. I didn't even That was a completely different angle than I thought you would go with it, because I think one of the things that they struggle with, at, at least what I hear from them online, is that because Islam's more than a religion, right? Like Islam is kind of like a philosophy. It also lends its hand in politics. It's
It's a religion.
no, it's a religion, but a religion that digs into politics, that digs into psychology, digs into philosophy, it digs into multiple disciplines.
I think that's part of the narrative that Muslim Americans are fed to try to glorify their heritage. No, Islam is a religion, and Muslim majority countries are so different along in terms of philosophy and politics and sociology. But I don't think that there were people who were Muslim who were philosophers, and there are people who were Muslims who were scientists, but they were Muslim. They
How
were
about
they were using they just because someone is a Christian, an avowed Christian, and they come up with certain a philosophy, that doesn't necessarily mean that it belongs to Christianity per se, right?
right?
Then you're in the world of theology.
How about, for example, they would argue that Jesus, peace be upon him, was strictly a religious figure, while the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was a political, uh, religious, philosophical, just a multiple headed dragon of a human being when it came to the things that he did. And that's what causes Islam to be more than just a religion, at least in what it focuses on.
Well, so the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was a prophet first and foremost, right? He got the revelation for that ultimately became what is now the Quran, and he was a statesman insofar as part of his divine mission, right? Part of his prophetic mandate was to expand the faith, right, and to um, proselytize and to expand the influence and followers within Islam. But I don't think that's any different than Christians. I think the Jewish faith might be the only exception because they don't believe in proselytization and because of the concept of the chosen people, which is theologically based for them. But most other religions, if you look at Christianity, uh, Christianity and empire were interlinked, right? And religious leaders were also considered political leaders at different points in history. And so I think it's a bit anachronistic to look back 1,500 years when, at that time, um, in order to be a political leader and in order to be a religious leader, didn't necessarily, it wasn't mutually exclusive,
It
right?
was the same thing, basically.
Yes, but then Abu Bakr and Umar and Uthman and Ali, they weren't prophets, and they were political leaders, but they were also considered kind of good Muslims. And so I don't think I think what the part of the problem is that we in the West, especially the Muslim diaspora, is taught a very nostalgic and very limited view of Islamic civilization that doesn't take into account all of the diversity of the various lands that were um, predominantly Muslim, and how the culture and the traditions of a particular location informed how Islam was practiced, such that not all of Islam was practiced, not all Muslims practice Islam exactly the same way. You just look at Shia Sunni, you look at the four schools of thought, right, within Sunniism, and then there's multiple sects of Shiaism, and a lot of that arises out of different local conditions. So one of the, and this is diasporic propaganda,
What
is
does diaspora mean? Because you use that a lot in your some of your writing, and I've heard you say it quite a bit. What
so
is diaspora?
diaspora are people who immigrated, or their parents or grandparents or great grandparents immigrated to a different land, and they are now part of that. They still have a connection back to the homeland or an identity, but they are the diaspora. So they are the people who now are somewhere else, physically located somewhere else, but they have a connection, even if it's just an identity connection. So, for example, Indians in Africa, as you know, there's large migrations of people from India. who went to Africa, and now there's third, fourth generation. So they could be called the Indian diaspora because they're
Okay.
originally in India. The diaspora means you're no longer in that country or you're no longer in those lands, and it could be third, fourth, fifth generation. Anyway, so part of the propaganda, I think, for to keep Muslims, well, a lot of parents, Muslim parents, want their kids to not leave the faith, and they want their kids to not be ashamed of their faith. And they know that it's hard to be a minority. And they also know that their faith is vilified a lot in the media. And so then they tend to oversimplify history and say, oh, we're all one, we're all the same. Islam is special, Islam is different, it's unique. And it's not that that's false, but it's very simplistic and it doesn't appreciate the richness of Islamic history that ranges all the way from Andalusia in Spain to Morocco, across North Africa, into the Levant, the Persian Gulf, Iran, Central Asia, Indonesia. All of those places are so different. And even though they have the same religion, it's like saying that, oh, people who are in Ecuador, because they're Catholic, have exactly the same way of practicing Catholicism as people in Spain. Yes, it's the same religion, but I'm sure it's very different because the culture impacts it. Right? And that particular local region impacts it and the history. And I think that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But we tend to be taught this very homogenized narrative that's false. And if you take classes in Middle East studies and Islamic civilization, it'll open your eyes to realize, wow, this is a really rich and deep and complex and varied. That's the important word, varied, different histories. And part of the propaganda of Saudi Arabia since the 1950s has been to try to persuade Muslims across the world that they're the representatives of Islam. Their interpretation of Islam is the only and right version because they are the protectors of Mecca and Medina, and that's false. Before the 1920s, the Persian Gulf was a bunch of tribes that were Bedouin that were living day to day. Before they discovered oil, the Persian Gulf politically was irrelevant. Right? The centers of power, the centers of civilization, the centers of intellectualism were in Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus. So there's a lot of misinformation even within Muslim communities, especially diaspora communities, because you don't have the access to the education to be able to check those narratives, right? It's not as if you get a class in high school and in college that can then teach you a more enriched and complex version of history.